In this week's episode, we're going to be making a standing paste, the kind of paste you'd use to make a standing crust pie. These pies held their shape without a pan or a mold, probably the earliest kind of pie crust you'll see in English cooking. Let's get started. Our standing crust has the same kind of ingredients as all the other pie crusts. It just has flour, has a little bit of salt, it has butter, and in this case we add a little bit of lard, and that's all that's really here in the pie crust. But it's completely different from other pie crusts in that instead of having a very cold butter that keeps a very delicate, soft, easy to eat crust, this does just the opposite, and we boil the butter in the water. So for water, we're going to need a half a cup of water plus 2 tablespoons. And in that, we're going to boil 3 tablespoons of butter and 3 tablespoons of lard. Let's get this boiling. Okay, our water and butter are boiled up here. I'm going to add our salt to our flour, about a 3-finger pinch there. I'm going to mix up salt a little bit. I'm going to make a pocket in the middle and pour in our liquids here. We're using 2½ cups of all-purpose flour. This is very hot. We don't want to burn ourselves, but I'm going to start the mixing around the edges. It should mix up into a very thick, kind of gooey dough, a lot like Play-Doh, very stiff and firm. Okay, I've got this gathered up. Let's put it out on our work surface. And we're going to have to knead this for a good 5 or 10 minutes. It's nice and easy to work while it's warm. Now let's roll this up. I'm going to cut that in half in 2 equal portions and then pull off of each ball about a walnut size piece. And these will turn out to be our lids. Make these into patties. We're going to cover these with a damp cloth and we're going to let them sit and rest at least 4 hours, even better, overnight. These pieces have rested, so let's get them into our final shapes. Got our 2 little lids here. And let's roll these out to the size we want for our top, about 1/8 of an inch thick and 5 or 6 inches in diameter. Do the other one. Those are the lids we're going to put on. Now we're going to do the bottom sections. We need to have a form to work around, to form our cavity with. I've got a glass here. It's 2.5 or 3 inches in diameter. You'll need something similar size to this for this single serving shell. So let's put it right in the very center of our patty of dough, and we're going to press down until we get about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch underneath. It's hard to tell. We can't tell exactly, but we can get a good guess. And it's going to squish up around the glass. So now we're going to form this up around our glass. Slowly, kind of pulling and squeezing it up. If your dough splits on you, here's a little split here, you can kind of heal that crack with a little bit of water. feel around and see that the thickness is about the same. And the bottom is about right, about 1/4 inch thick. So here we have our cup and our lid that'll go up on top and get crimped on depending on what kind of contents we have on the inside. And those we'll cover in future episodes where we'll have recipes that use this kind of shell. Let's take a look at exactly what this puff paste looks like when it's finished. We can break off a little piece here. You can see how layered and textured this stuff is. It's very similar to a modern croissant type dough. That's what we're going to be making today. I've got in our bowl here 3½ cups of cake flour, which is about a pound. This is Swan's cake flour here that we're using today. You can use a pastry flour, but you want something that's definitely a soft wheat flour that won't fight you like all-purpose flour will. To that, we're going to add a 3-finger pinch of salt, and now we're going to mix in some egg whites. There's about 1 cup worth of egg whites here. We're going to start out with this as our beginning dough here. The egg whites are going to help us roll this out really thin. This turned out to be a little too sticky, so I'm going to add in just a little bit more flour. It's much easier to add in a little bit of flour than it is to add more water in if it's too stiff. Now that we've got this dough mixed up, we're going to actually need to bring it out onto our work surface and knead it a little bit. So we want to get it out nice and soft. Now to prepare our butter, I've got a pound of butter here, 4 sticks laid out side by side. It's nice and cool. It's chilled butter. And we're going to cover this up with our cloth. I'm just pushing down here to mold this butter together in one big pad. We want to get this into a square that's about a 1/2 inch thick. There is our butter. So let's set this aside. I want to take a break here for just a second and talk about butter. Butter in the 18th century was definitely different than the kind of butter that we see in our grocery stores today. If you want to get closer to an 18th century butter flavor, I suggest trying out Kerrygold butter. It's going to be a lot closer to that kind of 18th century taste. Now it's time to work with our dough again. We're going to take our dough and roll it out about 1/4 inch thick. I'm purposely leaving the middle of our dough a little thick, and you'll see how that works a little bit later. Okay, I've rolled this out to about 1/8 inch, not 1/4 inch, but 1/8 inch, and this stuff really wants to fight you. You roll it out and it kind of relaxes back, but just keep working it and it'll work out. If you are using all-purpose flour instead of the cake flour, you'll have a lot more trouble with it. This is really where the two, there's a lot of difference. Now what we're going to do is put our pad of butter right here in the middle. And now we're going to fold our dough up over the top of it. We want this wrapped up tight with no air bubbles if we can help it. Now let's roll it out a little bit. Now we're going to fold this up in thirds. Then we're going to turn it 90 degrees and roll it out some more. Now we're going to wrap this up in its thirds one more time. We're going to put it in our cloth. We're going to set this aside in a nice cool place to rest for about 30 minutes. After 30 minutes of rest, we can do this whole operation over again. We roll it out into a long rectangle, fold it up, turn it 90 degrees, roll it out again, fold it up, and then rest. You want to do this 3 more times, so that 4 times altogether. During this whole time, make sure to keep this nice and cool. There, this one has been rolled out and rested. It's been rolled out 4 times, and it's ready to be taken out to its final thickness. We're going to roll this out to our useful 1/4 inch thick. There we go. We got it rolled out to our nice finished thickness. This can be used for all sorts of things. They call for this in 18th century cookbooks for meat pies, toppings of other pies. Sometimes you'll have 2 kinds of crust. You'll have a standing crust with a puff pastry on the top. So there's all kinds of things that this kind of pastry is used for. We'll use this crust in a number of recipes in upcoming episodes. In previous episodes, we made both a standing paste and a puff paste. In this week's episode, we're going to be doing the 3rd popular kind of paste that you will see in 18th century cooking. This one's called the short paste, very similar to a modern pie crust, usually used in the 18th century for tarts and fruit pies. Let's make some. Okay, we're starting off here with 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and to that I'm going to add a little 3-finger pinch of salt to that. I'm going to mix this up just a hair, and now we're going to add in our butter. This flour, I've got 2 cups. It's unsifted. It's about 12 ounces in weight, and here I've got 6 ounces of butter we're going to add to this. The ratio is about 2 to 1 by weight. 12 ounces of flour, in this case 6 ounces of butter. If you want to double this up, it's easy to double, just as long as you know the ratio of 2 to 1. I want my butter to be mixed in perfectly with this flour, but not melted in any way. I'm just trying to crumble the butter up with the flour with my fingertips alone. My fingers don't touch the butter for any great period of time for fear of melting that butter. We're going to get all those lumps broken up. Now that this butter is all incorporated, it's time to add our water. We're going to add this just a tablespoon at a time to get to the right consistency. We used about 3 or 4 tablespoons, maybe a little more, a little less. You wanted to make sure it's nice, cool water too. Now let's gather this up into a ball and roll it out. And we're going to flour our surface here. We want to keep rolling this out to where about 1/8 of an inch thick. There we go. We've got enough for a single crust. You need a top crust. You're going to need to make another one of these, so double up your recipe. This is perfect for use in our redware pie pan or in our tart tins. We're going to be using this crust in several upcoming episodes. Today we're going to be cooking an 18th century pear tart. This is a wonderful little fruit pie. Let's get started. We're going to start today with the crust, and you're going to need a short crust for this recipe. We've done a short paste in a previous episode, so you need to refer back to that about how to make your crust. And you're going to need a tart tin. Here's a 5-inch tart tin that's available on our website, and we've got it well buttered. Let's press this crust into place. Be sure to press this well into the corners. Now that that's ready, let's make our filling. This recipe is from Hannah Glass's The Complete Confectioner. The recipe calls for pears. We can use pears or we can use apples. Before we start peeling our pear and chopping it up, there's an easy and quick way to tell whether or not your pear is ripe, which you really want to use ripe pears in this recipe. You can squeeze it up toward the stem area. If it gives a little, if it's a little squishy up here, the pear is ready. If it's still hard at the tip here, it's not ripe yet. Now we need to have a slice of lemon peel that we put in our saucepan first, that all the pears go on top of. We're going to peel, core, and slice these pears up and put them in our saucepan. Now we're going to pour in just enough water to cover them. Let's put these on the fire to simmer until they're soft. Our pears are nice and softened. Now it's time to separate them from their liquid content. So I've got a screen here, a sifter, and we're going to pour those out. That's good. And they're still warm. If you don't have a sifter like this or a screen, you can use a piece of cloth to separate these out. We want to pick out our lemon peel, because that's not going to stay in there. Now we're going to take our pie tin with our crust in it, and we're going to take 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar. We're going to spread it in the bottom of our dish here. Spread nice and evenly. Now we're going to take our contents here, and we're going to transfer our pears into the crust. There are our pears. Now we're going to take another 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar and spread it on top. Now we're going to add just a spoonful of our pear juice back into the shell. And now we're going to finish up with some lemon juice right up on top to give it a little zing. Now it's time to put our top crust on. And we're going to need vent holes in that top crust. Now it's time to bake this. In a camp setting, this is easily baked in a Dutch oven. We can bake it in our earthen oven, or in a modern oven, you need to bake it at 350 degrees for about 30 minutes. And here is our Pear Tart right out of the oven. And it looks really good. We managed to get it separated from its little pan. We turned it up and tipped it out. Let's cut a little slice out of this. See how it tastes. That's really great. It's a great little tart. Christmas is very soon, Ivy.
Oh, I'm so excited.
So you like Christmas, huh?
Yeah, it's my favorite holiday.
Is it really now? Why do you like Christmas so much? It's your turn. Is it the presents?
Yes, and the Christmas tree and the food. Grammy.
Really? The food? What kind of food do you like?
What kind of food do I not like?
Oh, God.
It's your turn.
I've been wanting to make a special dish that was a favorite for Christmas for hundreds of years.
Really? What is it?
I want to make a mince pie using an old recipe from Elizabeth Raffald's 1769 cookbook, The Experienced English Housekeeper.
Oh, the experienced housekeeper. Can I help?
Well, let's clean up.
So what is mince pie, Dad?
It usually has lots of raisins in it. It's got nice tart apples. It has brandy. Sometimes it even has a little meat in it. And of course, spices.
What kind of meat?
Well, they usually have something that has a very smooth grain to it. So tongue or tenderloin.
Cow tongue? I like cow tongue.
Yeah, I know. You're a funny little girl, aren't you?
Are we going to use cow tongue?
Not in this recipe. This particular recipe is a meatless mince pie.
So how do we make it?
Well, we need to start with about a pound of currants and about a half a pound of raisins.
What are currants?
Currants are kind of like little tiny raisins.
Then why don't we just use raisins?
Well, you can use raisins instead of currants if you can't find them in your grocery store. Let's get these mixed up. Let's pour them out, and what we need to do is chop all these, down into a very minced up form. Doing it this old-fashioned way, it might take up to a half an hour to get these all minced up in their tiny little form. But if you're in a more modern kitchen, well, you can use a food processor, and it will only take a minute or two. So, here are our raisins and currants all chopped up. To this, we're going to add about a pound of our finely minced apple that we need to chop up the same kind of way. And then we have about 4 ounces of candied orange peel. I'll put that in here too. And then we have about a half a cup of regular white sugar.
Can I mix it up, Dad?
Not yet. First, we need to add some spices. We've got a teaspoon of cinnamon, a half a teaspoon of nutmeg, and a 1/4 teaspoon of clove, all ground up. And then we have 4 ounces of this brandy that we need to put in here. So let's put these all in too. There we go. Now we can mix it up. That's hard, isn't it?
It's sticky.
Here, let me give it a try. You're gonna really get that stuff off the bottom, get it all mixed up. The last thing we need to add to this is the suet.
Suet, what's that? Is that what we feed the birds in the winter?
Yes, suet is a special hard kind of fat that comes from the kidney area of cows and sheep. It not only makes the pie much more moist, but it also gives it an interesting texture.
Are we going to use suet?
No, we're not going to use real suet today in this recipe because suet can be very hard to find in the United States. If you ask your local butcher, he might be able to keep some suet out for you, or you might be able to order some online, but today we're going to use a substitute. About 10 ounces of vegetable shortening that we froze and then we grated. Let's just dump this in and get it mixed in.
It looks like butter.
Okay, this is all mixed up. This is our mincemeat ready to go. Now it's time to put it in our pie shell. What we're going to be using today is a puff paste.
I saw that video.
This puff paste has been rolled out pretty thin, about 1/8 of an inch, and I've got a bottom and a top right here. Let's put our mincemeat in here. We've prepared enough for about 2 pies this size, so we'll only use about half of this.
When will it be ready to eat?
Well, first we're going to have to bake it, and this pie will need to bake in a modern oven about an hour at 375, or until nice and golden brown. We're going to bake this in our earthen oven. You could also bake it in a Dutch oven.
Well, it's cooking. I feel in the mood to decorate. Is this ready?
Yep, it's ready. This pie you can eat hot or cold.
I think we should eat it now.
Okay, let's cut it up. There's your piece. There's mine. Let's give it a little taste. Here's your knife. Wow. That is great. Oh, you want to try the crust. Yeah. How's that puff paste?
I can't get it.
You got it. Is that good? Sweet, but it's not too sweet. It's got a nice texture. It's very moist. Really, really good. Welcome to another episode of 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Today we're going to be cooking an 18th century lemon cheesecake. Let's get started. This recipe is from Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, made plain and easy. We're going to need a tart tin. This is a 5-inch tart tin. We've already well buttered it, and we've got it filled with a short paste or a short crust, which is something that you'll find in a previous episode on how to make a short paste. There is a bit of a trick to this recipe. If you follow the recipe right out of Hannah Glass's book, it's not going to work out right. Things need to be done in a very particular order. So what we're going to start off with here is, we're going to start whipping 2 egg whites, and as soon as they start getting stiff, then we're going to add in 6 tablespoons of powdered sugar. This can take quite a while if you're doing it by hand. It looks like it's about ready. Let's start with the second half of our batter. We're going to be mixing in 4 tablespoons of melted butter with 3 egg yolks. Now that this is all mixed, we can put in the juice of 1 lemon. This is a little more than what the recipe called for, but the recipe seemed a little tame, at least with modern lemons. Now let's add 2 to 3 tablespoons of cream. And finally, the zest of 1 lemon. Now we're going to fold this in to our egg whites that we prepared earlier. Now I'm going to transfer this to our pipkin and put it over a low fire, stirring it the whole time. While we have this over the fire, we do have to be careful. It needs to be stirred constantly, and when it changes and stiffens, it will do so all at once. Now this is really thickened up. We've taken it off the fire and we're going to pour it right into our shell. Now it's time to bake this. We can bake this in a Dutch oven, or we can bake this in our earthen oven that we've got here. That's what we're going to do today. If you're doing it in a modern oven, it needs to be baked at 350 degrees for about 30 minutes. There, our pie is all baked up. Now, this is called a lemon cheesecake. 18th century cheesecakes aren't really like modern cheesecake. It's a lot more like a custard pie. You know, normally you eat these when they're cool. I don't think I can wait that long. Where's my fork? Here we go. Let's take a little taste. See how this turned out. Nice and lemony. This is really excellent. You need to give this one a try. In a recent episode, we made this meatless mince pie and we used vegetable shortening. Vegetable shortening is a late 19th century invention, but we suggested its use when suet is unavailable. In today's episode of 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son, we're going to be following up on this mince pie episode by looking more closely at suet. We're going to be looking at exactly what it is, what it isn't, how to prepare it, and the many 18th century uses for suet, both culinary and otherwise. Thanks for watching. First of all, let's look at exactly what suet is. Suet is the fat from the loin or kidney region of beef and mutton. It's going to be a completely different sort of fat that you're going to find on other parts of the animal, muscle fat. It's completely different. Although it looks the same, they're not the same at all. They have completely different properties. They taste different, they smell different, and most importantly, they have a very different texture when they're finished. Here's a block of rendered suet. This is very much like a piece of soap or almost like a soft wax. It's very, very hard and set up at room temperature. But the regular fat that you're going to get, the muscle fat, when it's rendered, this is very different. This is, it never really sets up unless it's very cold. At room temperature, this is kind of cold in here right now, but at room temperature, it's almost liquid. So it's a completely different thing. Suet is also different than lard. It's definitely going to have a different flavor to it and a different melting point. When you're shopping for suet, it's likely you're going to have to ask your butcher. You aren't going to see it out on the shelf. When you ask your butcher, you can't just ask for suet. He'll trot out a bag of this hard, regular muscular fat, which of course isn't going to give you the right product. You really need to be specific, and you need to ask for kidney fat. When you're shopping for your suet, you also want to look at the quality of the suet. You want really very fresh suet. You're looking for something that's creamy white in texture. You don't want a suet that is discolored in any way. You don't want a brown or a yellow suet. Now let's talk about preparing it. Whether you're going to use it rendered or in its raw state, we need to prepare our suet. Here, and let me show you what's going on. I'll cut off a chunk here. And you can see inside of this suet, there's all this connective tissue. And all this stuff needs to be gotten rid of, or at least as much as possible. Inside of this connective tissue are little segments of suet. And even inside those little segments are smaller pieces of connective tissue. Sometimes you'll also run into blood vessels and other things that you need to separate out. So you just want to end up with these little cubes of the suet inside. Now that we've got this picked, it's really time to take all those pieces, these larger pieces, and dice them up very, very fine. But we've already done that with this batch that I've got here. We can take a look at this. Now, you can tell from this it's got a very particular texture. It's very fine, but it holds its shape. That's one of the reasons why they use it in pudding recipes. It makes little holes in the pudding. It stays its shape, and then as the pudding cooks, it turns into a liquid and leaves a little hole behind, giving it a light texture. You can get online from the UK a modern processed version of suet. This is similar. It's very similar in its texture, but it is a little different. It does have 15% flour put into it, and it's a dehydrated product. So it's been sort of industrially produced, and it probably won't exchange one for one in 18th century recipes. It's going to be a little bit different. One advantage to this modern suet product is that it's prepared and it will last a long time. It's shelf stable and will probably last a year or two. Our suet that we've got here is fresh, and it will not last very long. It has to be refrigerated or it will grow rancid very rapidly unless we further prepare it. To render this suet, we're going to need to heat it up very slow. You're going to need a pot. A cast iron pot is really good for this because it can withstand a lot of abuse. You don't want to have something like a copper pot that if you set it by the fire and you forget it, it's going to damage it. So the cast iron pot is perfect for this purpose. And what we do is take our cast iron pot, we're going to put our already minced up suet. We're going to pour it into this pot. And there, that's probably enough. We're going to set it close to the fire. We're going to set it right beside our fire. We're not going to put it in the fire or over the fire because we don't want to cook the suet. We're really just warming it up. We just want to get it so that we're separating this leftover connective tissue that's still in here with the oil or the fat that's inside the suet. I'm going to hang this near the fire, but I don't want to hang it directly over it or put it right in it. You definitely want to take your time on this. You want to keep a close eye on it. You don't want it to cook. You just want it to stay warm. This whole process is going to take several hours. You're going to want to come in here every once in a while and stir up the batch. If you're working in a modern kitchen, there's an easier way to do this, and that is with your slow cooker. You can take your diced suet and you can dump that in your slow cooker in the morning. Then you can set that on low or medium, go to work, and when you come home at night, it'll be ready. Our suet is all rendered down here. It's all completely melted, but of course there's still some connective tissue that is floating around in here. In fact, earlier experiments that we've done with this has shown that even after we've pulled it all apart and diced it up, that it's still about 1/4 of this connective tissue. So you're going to get a yield of about 3/4 of this is going to be the good suet. I've got here, it's all melted, and I'm going to pour it through this sieve here to separate them out. If you don't have a sieve, then you can use a piece of cloth. There we go. These leftover little pieces of the connective tissue, those are called graves. And even in the 18th century, they had uses for this too. Now that we've got this strained, what I'm going to do while it's still in its molten state is to pour this off into a couple little pans I've got here. You can also pour this straight into a pan of water and let it solidify in that. And that also helps separate out some of the impurities. Our 18th century recipes call for, once this the suet has solidified, to actually take our cake and then wrap it in paper, and then wrap that paper in linen for long-term storage. Suet preserved in this way can last a long time, several months, and they used it in the 18th century for dozens of uses. It's used in puddings, pies, dumplings. It's also used in pickling and preserving. Here are some brandied peaches that are sealed off with suet. And it's also used in deep frying and grilling. In addition to those, there are many non-food uses. Candles, soap, shoe polish, salves and medicines, leather treatment, lamp oil. They used it as a rust inhibitor. They also used the leftover graves as fish bait. We even found an 18th century recipe where they used the suet and they made an 18th century version of carbon paper. Suet was an important part of 18th century foodways and life in general. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. In this episode of 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son, we're going to be cooking this delicious meat pie with a standing crust pastry. Raised pies like this have been cooked for centuries in English kitchens. They can be eaten hot or cold, and they make a great portable meal. Today I'm going to show you how to make this delicious 18th century meal to go. Thanks for watching. In a previous episode, we covered how to make a standing paste. You're going to want to watch that video because today we're starting where that one leaves off. Standing or raised crusts are made by using flour, boiling water, and fat. In the previous video I mentioned, we used an equal portion of butter and lard. Today we've used rendered suet in our crusts. Period recipes make it clear that different types of fat were a possible ingredient for this type of crust. Sometimes they used butter, muscle fat, lard, or tallow. Now the first three, the butter, the lard, and the muscle fat, all can be worked while the dough is cold. They actually work a little bit better when the dough is cold to roll it out. If you're working with the suet, you really need to work with it while it's still warm, and the recipes call for that, tell you to work it while it's still warm. We've made 2 small pastry cups with our standing crust for our pie. You could also make a larger pie with exactly the same type of crust. Richard Briggs, in his 1788 cookbook, The English Art of Cookery, mentions that you can make these pies with several different kinds of meat. Other 18th century references mention standing crusts being used for mince pies or even custards. Today, we're going to be using pork. Once you have your pastry shells made, the rest of this recipe is rather simple. We're going to be using about a pound of pork for this. A pork shoulder is an excellent cut for this particular thing. The recipes in the 18th century actually call for pounding this pork out to tenderize it. But since today's pork is already very tender as it comes from the store, we really don't need to do that. We're going to slice this thinly in smaller pieces. You're going to want this meat fairly lean. You want to cut away any fat or silver skin. Our seasoning for this is rather simple. We want some salt and a good healthy dose of pepper. Another variation of seasoning this would be using some nutmeg, a little bit of sugar, and some apples. And that you would call a Cheshire pie. When you pack this meat into your shells, you want to pack it fairly tightly. The meat, as it bakes in the shell, will shrink up and it'll leave an airspace around the outside. Now it's time to put on the lids. To get them to adhere properly, we're going to take a little bit of egg wash and brush it on the inside lip here of our pie crusts. Now here is where it's critical that your lids are kept warm. If you're at home, you can pop them in a microwave for a few seconds or keep them by the fire if you're at a camp. You want them to be warm so they're pliable. We also need to brush our lids with the egg wash. Kind of warm, it's soaking in. We're going to just turn that in and tuck that all around. We want it to seal nicely all around the edge. It's nice and warm, it makes it really easy. Let's do the other one. There we go, it's sealing nicely. I'm going to go ahead and cut a 1-inch hole in the top of each one of these. I'll explain why later. The last thing we need to do before we put these in the oven is take our egg wash and coat them all over on the outside, except of course for the bottom. These are now ready for the oven. You can bake these in an earthen oven like we're going to use today. You can also bake them in a Dutch oven, that would work well. Or if you're baking them at home in your regular home oven, you'd bake them at 375 degrees for about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. You want to keep an eye on them, make sure they don't burn or scorch on the bottom. While these pies are baking, let's make a gravy for them. A gravy in the 18th century was a very loose term. It could mean a lot of different things. A simple broth, a thickened and fortified broth, or even a gelatin. Our gravy is going to be a gelatin gravy. This might also be called a caudle or a leer. We're going to make it by boiling pig's feet. We're going to pour in just enough water to cover these up. Then we're going to put them by the fire and have it simmer for about an hour or until it reduces by about half. If the thought of boiling pig's feet in your kitchen is not desirable, then you can take a couple of packets of unflavored gelatin and boil them in about 1.5 cups of water. Our pie is done and we've let it cool a little bit. We also have our gravy, which we've strained. Now this is why we've cut a little hole in the top of our lid. We can take that off and now we can pour in our gravy to fill this up to the top. There we go. Well, all these wonderful smells. I've got this one ready to go. This one's cool and the gravy has set. It's ready to eat. Let's try it out. There we are. In the 18th century, pies like this, the crusts weren't necessarily intended to be eaten. A lot of people would take them, cut them open on the top, eat out the internals, and then just throw away the crust. I think I'm going to eat the whole thing. It's really good. These meat pies are a perfect portable thing. If you want to have them prepared beforehand, you can bring these to an event all ready to eat, or you can make them at an event. They're not very difficult. Really wonderful tasting. Everybody's going to love this. Even the crust. A few episodes ago, we showed you how to make an 18th century style lemon cheesecake. Today, we're going to be doing yet another style of cheesecake. Today in the United States, when we say cheesecake, everyone thinks of a cream cheese style cheesecake made famous by Lindy's restaurant in the mid-20th century. Cheesecake was popular in the 17th and 18th century and earlier, but most of the time it was made with cheese, sometimes not with cheese, but had a cheese-like consistency. The cheesecake we're going to be making today is one of those cheesecake in consistency only type cheesecakes. Now the first ingredient we need today, potatoes. Yeah, I threw you off with that one, didn't I? What we're going to do is peel and chop 1/2 pound of potatoes. We're going to toss them into some boiling water and boil them until they're tender. We need to prepare the other ingredients. We need 3 eggs plus 3 egg yolks. We also need to have some butter melted. You'll need about 8 ounces or 1/2 pound of butter. Our butter is melted, but it's not so hot that it's going to cook our eggs. So we're going to go ahead and pour the butter in and whisk it up with our eggs. Our potatoes have finished boiling, and I've strained them out and let them cool. And now I'm just going to mash them up with a spoon here. You want to make sure to take the time to get these potatoes mashed up very nice and finely, very smooth, because we're looking for a very smooth consistency. Now that we've got our potatoes all mashed up, we can put them in with our eggs and butter. Let's see if we can get this whisked into a nice smooth consistency. Our last 2 ingredients here, sugar. We need about 2 tablespoons or so for this size. That looks about right. And we're going to need some nutmeg. About 1/2 or maybe 1/4 of a nutmeg, grated. Now let's whisk these up one final time. We need to have a pie pan ready to go for our filling. I've greased a redware pie pan here, and I've placed some puff paste just around the outside edge. We're really just adding this for looks, and it also helps a little bit in knowing when our pie is finished cooking. This amount fills our redware pie pan, which is about an 8 or a 9-inch pie pan, really well. You want to make sure that you don't overfill your pan because this is going to grow a little bit. So about 2/3 full or maybe half full is a good amount in your pie pan. This is ready for baking. I'm going to put this in our earthen oven, and it needs to bake approximately 20 to 30 minutes. It really depends on your oven temperature. If you're going to bake this in your oven at home, then 350 degrees, preheat your oven, and about 30 minutes should be right. But you want to make sure to watch this. You don't want it to overcook. Your puff paste is going to help you know when it's getting cooked, but you want to make sure to cook it enough so that it solidifies. You don't want it to be liquid in the center. So that's the thing to watch for. Watch that center. Make sure it's cooked up well. Our pie has cooled. Now is the real test. What's it taste like? This is really a wonderful. I don't think anybody would guess this is 1/3 potato. A very wonderful texture, nice taste. The nutmeg is really something different. You're not really used to that kind of flavor. It's really, really great. And this is very simple. I mean, just a couple ingredients. Very easy to make. You can bake this right there in the camp in a Dutch oven or in your kitchen at home. Really a wonderful little dish. When we think of pancakes today, usually in the United States, we think of a light and fluffy pancake, probably made from a box mix, drenched over the top with a brown and sticky sweet substance. This is only the most recent version of a dish that's been popular for thousands of years. In the 18th century, pancakes were popular for both common folks and the gentry. For some, it might be the final course of the meal. For others, it might be all they had to eat. Today we're going to be cooking an authentic 18th century style pancake using William Ellis's cookbook, A Country Housewife's Family Companion. Thanks for joining us. word pancake appears in the English dialect in the 1400s, but pancakes have been made and enjoyed since at least the Roman times. Modern North American pancakes differ from English-style pancakes in that we normally use baking powder, a 19th century development which causes a light and fluffy pancake. English pancakes, on the other hand, really haven't changed for hundreds of years. The pancakes we'll be making today are common milk pancakes. There are a wide variety of pancake recipes in 18th century cookbooks. Some use common ingredients, while others are more expensive. One of the most helpful books in understanding this variation in pancake is William Ellis's Country Housewife's Family Companion. In this book, he gives examples from very simple pancakes for poor people using just water or beer to a much more luxurious pancake using cream, sherry, wine, and even brandy. For our 18th century pancake batter, we're going to start off with 2 cups of flour. To that, we're going to add some spices, as most of the 18th century recipes are spiced very interestingly compared to our pancakes. This has a half a teaspoon of nutmeg, a half a teaspoon of salt, and a full teaspoon of ginger. We're going to add 1 egg to our flour. And then we're going to add some milk. We're going to start off with about a cup of milk. We're going to get this all incorporated, and then we're going to add more milk until we get to the right consistency. Now that this is a little thinner, I'm going to switch to a whisk. With modern American pancakes, you only whisk the bare minimum to get the ingredients stirred up. With these style pancakes, you want to whisk it until the batter is completely consistent and smooth. You want to thin this down until it's about the consistency of heavy cream. If you're doing this at home, don't be afraid to do it in a blender. I've melted some butter in our pan, and now I'm going to put in about 1/4 cup of batter. And we're going to swirl it around just a hair to get it nice and thin. There we go. We're going to fry these on one side, and then when they're done, flip them over. The other side should only take about 30 seconds. A common variation of this would be to peel, core, and slice apples very thinly and fry them in a little butter. Once they've softened, pour a little batter right on top of them. This would be called the fritter. And there you go, authentic 18th century style pancakes. Sprinkle a little bit more sugar on top, squeeze a little lemon, which even today is the traditional sauce for English style pancakes. You know, you can use these for dessert. You can also make this the entire meal. You can wrap these up in a cloth and send them out into the field to be eaten cold. Any way you stack them, these are great. In our last episode of 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son, we made common milk pancakes. Today we're going to be making a much finer version of pancake called a quire of paper from John Farley's cookbook, The London Art of Cookery. Thanks for joining us. A quire is a term borrowed from bookbinders and printers. It's a bundle of pages that are put together, folded over, and bound into a book. Our recipe today is a quire of paper, which is an 18th century version of modern day crepes. The ingredients we're using today would be a bit expensive in the 18th century. This recipe would likely have been enjoyed by the gentry as opposed to common folk. We're going to start off this recipe with just 3 tablespoons of flour. I know it doesn't sound like much, but just 3 tablespoons. To that, we're going to add a good pinch of salt. We're going to add 2 or 3 teaspoons of sugar, And we're also going to add some ground ginger to this, which is very common in all these recipes. About a teaspoon of ground ginger. In a separate bowl, we're going to mix our wet ingredients. I've got 3 eggs here and about a cup of cream. I've got 4 ounces of melted butter. I know, it sounds like a lot. Now we're going to add to that sack. I've got we're going to add about 3 tablespoons of sack. Maybe just a little more. There. And for our final ingredient, we've got orange blossom water. We need about a tablespoon of that. You can get orange blossom water online or at a Middle Eastern market. Now I'll add the dry ingredients. Don't be alarmed by how runny this batter is. If you find your mixture a little too lumpy, it's probably the butter too cold. Try warming up your mixture, it'll probably smooth right out. I'm going to use about 1/4 cup of our batter here. And then we're going to spread it out. You'll want to brown these until they're nice and crispy on the edges. You want to make sure these are separated from the pan. Then get your spatula under the far edge and flip it. These can be very difficult to flip over in the pan. Many of the recipes called for the experienced cooks to actually flip them in the pan without a spatula. They are very tricky to flip over. They do take a good bit of practice. You can sprinkle a little bit of sugar on this and then squeeze a little lemon on it, or for a different sauce, you can have a little sugar, butter, and sack. It's delicious. In past episodes, we've done a couple of different dishes that were called cheesecakes, but were different from what we know as a modern-day cheesecake. Today, we're going to be cooking something that's a good bit closer to what we might call a cheesecake, but with an interesting twist. Today's recipe is from William Abishaw's Whole Body of Cookery Dissected. It's from 1682. The recipe reads thus. To make a cheese tart, take about 3/4 pound of old cheese of Parmesan and grate it and put it into a stone mortar with about a dozen eggs, casting away 6 of the whites. Put therein 1/2 pound of sweet butter melted with some ginger, cinnamon, grated nutmeg, and salt, with a penny manchet grated. Season it with sugar and rose water, then beat it into so much cream that it may be thin or thinner than batter for fritters. You may make it in a dish on a sheet of paste and put over it crossbars of puff paste, so bake it and garnish it. This recipe makes quite a bit of filling, so we're going to cut it in half. We're going to start off here with 6 ounces of freshly grated Parmesan cheese. Now we need eggs. We need 3 whole eggs and 3 egg yolks. Now we're going to add 4 ounces of melted butter. He calls for some interesting spices in here, some very standard ones. Of course, we've got here a teaspoon of salt. I've got a teaspoon of ginger. I've got about a teaspoon of cinnamon, and we're going to need maybe about 1/2 nutmeg grated up. Now the recipe calls for a penny manchet loaf grated. Manchet is a common thing you'll see in recipes in the 18th century. Manchet loaves were a very white bread. The loaves were typically around a 6-ounce loaf. You'll see them in a lot of period paintings, especially in the 17th century. They look a bit like hamburger buns. They were baked on a big sheet with lots of loaves together, and so you'll see them where they've been pulled apart. Anyway, I've got 3 ounces of the Manchet grated up here. We're going to toss it in. Now, this pie seems to be a very adjustable pie. If you want a savory pie, then just include 1 tablespoon of sugar. If you want something a little sweeter, a little bit more on the dessert end, then go ahead and put in 2 or 3 tablespoons of sugar, and then after your pie is mixed, just before you slide it into the oven, sprinkle sugar on top. Okay, we got this all incorporated, and the next thing to do is to add cream until we get to a fritter-like consistency. Now that's a pretty runny batter, so we need to add quite a bit of cream. Okay, our batter looks about right. I've already got a little pewter bowl here lined with a short paste, and make sure to butter this first. These pewter bowls are really great for little jobs like this. You can use them for baking. They're a perfect eating bowl. They're virtually indestructible, so they're a great period bowl to use. You can get these on our website or from our print catalog. I've got enough batter here for probably a half a dozen little tartlets this size, or at least 2 regular size pies. You want to give this batter a quick stir right before you pour it in. Now the final little garnish, we're going to put a couple of strips of puff paste onto the pie. You could make a lattice, but it just calls for crossbars. That looks equally good. Just going to put that on there like that. Cut off the excess. Now I'm going to sprinkle a little sugar on top. And now it's ready to go in the oven. This should be baked at 350 in a regular home oven for probably 30 minutes or so for one this size. If you're doing a full-size pie, it might be up to an hour. It's something you're going to want to watch as it bakes. The puff paste really helps you know when it's done, and you'll also see it sort of puff up a little bit and brown nicely on the top. Then you'll know it's done. Let's get this one in the oven. Well, it's all baked. It makes a very beautiful looking pie. Let's get this sliced and get a taste. This is a really good pie. It's got a very interesting texture. It's a lot more like a cheesecake texture. Even though it's got a lot of Parmesan cheese, it doesn't have a real hard Parmesan bite. You can leave it like this. It makes a nice savory pie if you don't put too much sugar in it. It would go great with fruit. If you want to add more sugar to it, you can make a nice dessert pie. It's not very overbearing at all. So if you want to add a little bit more one spice or the other so you can get a real different kind of flavor, it's a great pie that makes a base for many different flavors. In an earlier episode, we showed you how to make a small standing crust that can be used for individual meat pies. In this episode, we're going to be making a larger standing crust, sometimes called a coffin, to be used for meats, vegetables, or sweet pies. Thanks for watching. tried several different recipes for standing crusts. Today we've settled on Mrs. Fraser's recipe from her 1791 cookbook, A Practice of Cookery. Most of the period recipes make several pie crusts. We've cut back the portions on today's recipe to make a single 8 or 9-inch pie crust. We'll start with 12 ounces of water boiling in our pipkin, and to that we're going to add 6 ounces of butter. That's about a stick and a half. In a large bowl, I've got 6 cups of flour. To that, I'm going to add 1 whole egg and just 1 egg yolk, saving this white for later. Once your butter and your water are boiling, then you can add the entire amount to your flour. I'll stir this for a while to make sure all our ingredients are incorporated. Then I can turn this out onto our floured work surface to knead. This will have a grainy texture like Play-Doh. After kneading this for a while, you can let it set for 5 minutes. That'll help it relax and smooth out. I'll cut our piece of dough into thirds, and then I'm going to roll out one piece about 3/8 inch thick. I want to work this while it's still warm. It's much easier to work in this state. I'm using our 8-inch cake ring as a template. This will be the base for our pie. I'll repeat this for the top. Any extra dough that we have remaining, we can work back into the lump. Next, we need to roll our wall out. It needs to be 25 to 27 inches long and about a 1/2 inch thick. We're going to use our peel handle as our straight edge. I want to cut this about 2.5 inches wide. Now I have the base, the top, and the sides. I'm going to set these aside so that they can cool completely. The dough we have left over here, we're going to roll out to about 1/8 of an inch thick, and then we can cut out our leaf decorations. The last little bit of dough here, I'm going to cut into thin strips and then twist. As this dough cools, it will stiffen up, and you'll appreciate this. Trying to build a coffin out of warm dough is very difficult, so I suggest making your parts 3 to 4 hours in advance, even better overnight. We'll start the construction with the egg white that we saved earlier on. We're going to take some of that egg white and brush it around the edge of the base. Now it's time to add our wall. It needs to rest on top of the base, flush with its outer edge. If the wall overlaps at its ends, trim it down so the ends meet neatly together. Be sure to brush one of the ends with the egg white as well. Now you'll need to make sure everything is pressed together and sealed tightly. I will also brush the egg white on the back of our decorations and press them onto our coffin. You should cover up the seam in your walls with one of the leaf decorations. While we're at it, let's put a few leaves on the lid. Now let's brush the entire outside with what's left of our egg white. We're going to partially bake our crust now. This half baking process will set the crust and make it sturdy enough so that it can withstand the steam when we put in our contents and bake them. Before we do that, we need something to support the lid. I've got this tin plate here, and that will support it perfectly. And finally, we're going to need something that might help support the walls as this bakes. So I've got some dry rice here. If you're baking this in a home oven, you need to set it for about 450 degrees. You want to bake it for about 15 minutes until it gets just some light brown edges. You'll definitely want to make sure to bake this at that 450 degrees. Any cooler and it's likely to sag while it's baking. There is our half-baked and ready to be filled standing crust. We've already removed the rice filling. We've baked it just long enough for the very edges to brown up, so it's sturdy enough to move. You may have found that the bottom here has puffed up a little bit. If you need to, it's still rather flexible, especially while it's warm, that you can press that back down into shape. In our last episode, we showed you how to make a large standing crust, ready to receive whatever filling you desire. Today we're picking up where we left off, and we're sharing with you a 1795 recipe for vegetable pie from Sarah Martin's cookbook, The New Experienced English Housekeeper. Thanks for watching. This vegetable pie would be served in the summer when vegetables are plentiful. A spring version of this same pie, you could use all the wild things that come up right away in the spring. The recipe we're using today calls for cabbage, cauliflower, onions, celery, and endive. If your endive is too bitter, then you can substitute spinach. In her cookbook, Sarah Martin routinely suggests boiling vegetables in milk and water. I believe she does this so that she can use this leftover broth as a richer base for other sauces later on. So in here I've got boiling or simmering a 50-50 mix of milk and water. I've chopped all our vegetables and I'm going to parboil them. I'm going to start off with our potatoes and our cauliflower since they take the longest to cook. We'll let these boil for about 5 minutes. Next we'll add some sliced onions, celery, and cabbage, and we'll let this boil for another 5 minutes. And finally we'll add our chopped endive, and we'll let this go for just a few more minutes. Our total cooking time has been about 15 minutes. It's time to take this off the fire, strain the vegetables out, and set them aside. We boiled all our vegetables together, so that's the way they're going to go into the pie. If you boil your vegetables separately, then you can layer them into the pie as the recipe suggests. Now for the coffin. Standing crusts in the time period weren't necessarily intended to be eaten. They were designed to serve as cooking vessels. Many times when it was done, the contents would be served up, and then the shell would later on be discarded or used as a thickening agent in soups and stews. In addition, especially with meat pies, the lid would be sealed to the body, a small hole would be cut in the top, and they would be baked. Once the pie was cool, they would pour in melted suet or clarified butter, seal that top back up, and they could use this standing crust as a storage vessel. These might be stored for 2 or 3 weeks in a cool pantry. The pie we're serving today is meant to be served up immediately. Let's get back to our vegetables. I'm going to season them with a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of mace, and a pinch of cayenne. Now this is ready for the oven. If you're baking this at home, I recommend 350 degrees. It'll probably take about an hour, but make sure to watch that crust. You don't want to burn it. While this is baking, we can work on our fricassee sauce. I'm starting off with butter, about the size of a very large chicken egg. I've dredged it in flour, and I'm going to put it in the pan here to brown this flour. To this, we're going to add 2 or 3 cups of our milk broth that we use to boil our vegetables. The butter and the flour are going to thicken this up into a creamy white fricassee sauce. We'll season this with a little salt, a little pepper, and maybe some sweet herbs. Okay, our pie is done. It's beautiful. We should be able to take off our lid here. It comes right off. Now we can pour in our white fricassee sauce. Let's give this a try. Wow, all those flavors go together wonderfully. All those different vegetables and the fricassee sauce. Very, very good flavors that all come together. The pie is beautiful. I think you're gonna love this. In our last episode of 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son, we made a wonderful beef pasty with a thick puff paste crust. In this episode, we're going to be doing a beef pasty, which is probably what most people think of today. Also very common in 18th century cooking. Thanks for watching. While it seems apparent that the most common type of pasty recipe in the 18th century was one baked in a dish, handheld versions did exist. Some 18th century recipes suggest making meat pies in the same fashion one would make an apple pasty, also called an apple foot, where the puff paste was folded over the filling and crimped along the edge. Charles Carter, in his 1749 cookbook, The London and Country Cook, offers a recipe for little meat pasties that are deep fried. And John Mallard, in his 1808 cookbook, The Art of Cookery Made Easy and Refined, includes a recipe for a beef pasty he calls a puff for a journey. Today's recipe comes from an earlier version of Mr. Mallard's cookbook. It's called Puffs with a forcemeat of vegetables. Let's get started. To make this dish, you'll need to make a puff paste. Be sure to watch our earlier episode on how to do that. This recipe calls for a pound of veal. If you don't have veal, regular beef will do. Also, we need 2 ounces of what the recipe calls fat bacon. In the grocery store today, you'll find either salt pork or jowl bacon. That's what you'll need to use. In addition, we'll need some green beans, or what they call French beans, some mushrooms, some asparagus, and onion. And we also need some parsley. Of all the vegetables, I've got about a cup each in here. It's all been coarsely chopped. Even the meat, it's all added in. I want to season this well with salt and pepper. Next, I'll place the fat bacon in the pan. I'll fry this for just a couple of minutes to render out some of the fat. Then I'll add the remainder of the ingredients and then fry this all up for about 5 minutes. I'll also squeeze the juice of 1 lemon into it. After I fry this for about 5 minutes, I'll transfer it to a bowl and allow it to cool for a few minutes. Now this is cooled off, we can add about a cup of breadcrumbs. If you've got a ship's biscuit, this is perfect. You can pound this up or grate this up. Otherwise, regular breadcrumbs. In a separate bowl, I'll mix about a half a cup of cream with 1 egg yolk. Then I'll add that to our vegetable mix. Now to our puff paste. I've rolled this out to 1/8 of an inch thick. Now we're going to cut it in about 6-inch squares. I'll spoon some of our vegetable mix in the middle of each square. Then I'll brush the edges with egg wash. and fold the puff paste over to form a triangle. You can crimp the edges or just pinch them with your fingers. This can be baked if you like. You can put these on a paper-lined cooking sheet, and for 45 minutes at about 350. But the recipe calls for this to be fried, so that's what we're going to do. This recipe calls for lard. I've placed a pot over the fire and I've got it to about 350 degrees. Of course, you'll need to use extreme caution if you're cooking with this oil, especially over an open fire. These should fry 15 or 20 minutes. If your oil is too hot, they will brown too quickly and the insides will still be doughy. Okay, I can't wait. These are just cooled off enough. Let's give it a try. These are excellent. Very good. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Today we're going to be cooking a traditional seagoing dish called Lobscouse. Back in our second season, we showed you how to make ship's bread, or hardtack as it's sometimes known, in the 19th century. This food was a staple for 18th century sailors, sometimes issued to soldiers or given to travelers also. The problem with this food is that it's very difficult to eat. And so there were special dishes made just to make use of this very sturdy food. One of these special dishes is called Lobscouse. Lobscouse is a bit of a generic term in the 18th century for a simple kind of stew made with meat, with ship's bread, and sometimes vegetables. Now, none of the 18th century cookbooks I've looked at reference Lobscouse specifically, but there are references to it in 18th century literature, and these give us some really good hints as to what it would be like. In Francis Krause's 1785, a classic dictionary of the vulgar tongue, he describes Lobscouse as this: a dish much eaten at sea, composed of salt beef, biscuit, onions, well peppered, and stewed together. And Janet Shaw in 1774 wrote this in her Journal of a Lady of Quality. She writes, "Lobscouse is one of the most savory dishes I ever ate. It is composed of salt beef, hung by a string over the side of the ship till rendered tolerably fresh, and then cut into nice little pieces, and with potatoes, onions, and pepper, is stewed for some time. And with the addition of a portion of water, this is my favorite dish." Let's get started. Today we're going to be using fresh beef. In the 18th century, it's more likely you're going to be using a salt pork or a salt beef. If you're going to be using a salt beef or a salt pork, then you need to soak this first. You'll need to have the salt meat in fresh water for a couple of hours. Probably want to change the water once or twice to get rid of the excess salt. First, we're going to chop up our meat into its small pieces. I'm using about a pound, maybe a pound and a half. This I'm using chuck roast. You can get stew meat from the grocery store. That'll work great too. There we go. There's all our meat chopped up. Also, let's chop up some onion to go with it. Let's get our meat browned up. I've got some drippings here. The ship's cook would have used slush, which is the drippings that come to the top of the meat while it's boiling. Earlier I put 2 quarts of water in a cast iron pot to get it nice and hot. If you are using salt beef, you don't have to brown it like this. All you need to do is put it in the cold water and then start it boiling. If you're using fresh beef like this, you want to brown it first and then you want to put it into boiling water. The water is boiling, so we can put the meat directly in. Now we've got our meat in here. We're gonna allow this to boil about an hour or until the meat is nice and tender. We wanna make sure to check it every once in a while so that the water doesn't all boil away. If you've got a lid for your pot, it's a good time to put a lid on it. Now that this is boiling, let's prepare our other ingredients. Lobscouse doesn't necessarily have to have vegetables, but vegetables make a great addition to this. We're going to peel and chop up a couple of potatoes and several carrots. We're also going to need pounded up ship's biscuit. And I've got some fresh biscuits here. Well, they're still nice and hard. I've also got some of the very old biscuits, and the old ones you want to check for bugs. It was common in the 18th century for the biscuits to have bugs in them, and even today they very easily get bugs. If you look at these biscuits here, you'll see the little worms in there. It's usually they're easy to tell right off the bat because you look in the little holes, and if you see a little bit of something like sawdust, that means there are weevils or worms inside of your biscuit. It looks like that if you use whole wheat in your biscuits, they're a little more likely to get worms. The ones where you use a white bleached flour, seems like the worms don't like them quite as well. Anyway, I'm going to pick out about a pound of biscuits here that don't look like they have too many worms in them. Put them in a nice cloth here. In a pudding bag would be good. And take a rolling pin or a tomahawk, or on board ship they'd probably use a marlin spike. There, our biscuits are all pounded up and ready. Let's go see how our meat's doing. The meat's tender enough. It's been boiling about an hour. We can go ahead and put in our potatoes and carrots at this point. We're going to let this boil for another 15 minutes or so, and then we're going to add our pounded up biscuits. Let's give this a little stir. Get everything nice and mixed up. If you want a very soupy mixture, then you want to put these potatoes and especially the ship's biscuit in a little bit later, like I did here. If you want it to be very thick, then you want to put this ship's biscuit in very early. Sometimes as early as when you put the meat in to begin with, or more likely in right there with the potatoes and the carrots, and let them boil up for a good half hour. That'll make a very thick and hearty dish. I'll let this cook for another 15 minutes. This is one of the cast iron pots that we sell at James Townsend & Son. This is the 5-quart pot. We also have a smaller 2-quart pot. This pot is perfect for this kind of use. It spreads the heat out very evenly and is virtually indestructible pot. So if you'd accidentally leave it on the fire too long, you can't really damage the pot. You might have to re-season it, but that's it. While these are very heavy, they're also really good for this kind of use. This has been cooking for about 15 minutes and it looks perfect. It's thickened up nicely. So let's dish this up. Well, we've let this cool a little bit and it smells wonderful. Let's add some salt and pepper to it first. Usually this is made with salt beef and salt pork. So it's naturally going to be a little bit saltier. So I'm going to add some salt to it because this was just fresh stuff. And of course, they call for pepper in a lot of the descriptions. Wow, this is really excellent. Sort of like a sailor's beef stew. And the ship's biscuits are really good in this. If you put them in early, they kind of really break up and make a real thick mixture. Or if you wait a little bit later, they still keep a lot of their texture, and they're almost like little bits of meat. They have a really interesting flavor to them in a dish like this. Everyone is going to like this.